"You saved my people. Now you may ask me for anything," said the Apache woman. The sun was just rising over the rugged hills when Daniel tightened the straps on his worn leather satchel and took a deep breath. He had been traveling for days, his horse's hooves kicking up clouds of dust that hung heavy in the dry morning air. The frontier had always been a place of mystery, danger, and opportunity, but today felt different. Today he felt a weight in his chest, a sense that what he was about to face could change his life forever. Daniel was a young doctor, barely in his 20s, but his hands had already healed more wounds than most men saw in a lifetime. He had trained in a small medical school back east, but the lessons of the classroom had never prepared him for the wildness of the frontier. Disease, injuries, and human suffering came in forms that no book could describe. And yet he had always felt a calling, a quiet voice that whispered whenever he heard someone cry out in need, "Go." The settlement he was approaching was small, barely more than a cluster of wooden cabins with a few dirt paths winding between them. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, hinting at life inside, but there was an air of unease about the place. Daniel could see it even from the edge of the hills. Men moving with tension, women standing at doorways with wary eyes, children clutching the hems of their mothers' skirts. Something had happened here, and he intended to find out what. As he rode into the settlement, the locals eyed him cautiously. Strangers were not often welcome in these parts, especially young men traveling alone. A few men stepped into the road, hands hovering near the tools and weapons they carried. Daniel lifted a hand in greeting, letting them see that he carried no gun, only his satchel. "I'm Dr. Daniel," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm here to help." There was a moment of silence. Then an older man, his face weathered and lined from years under the sun, stepped forward. "Help?" "You mean you're a doctor?" he asked, skepticism clear in his tone. "Yes," Daniel replied, adjusting the straps of his satchel. "I can treat injuries, illness, anything I can do to make things better." The man's eyes softened slightly. "We could use someone like you," he admitted. "Come with me." Daniel followed him through the narrow paths of the settlement. The closer he got, the more he saw the effects of hardship. Families were huddled in small cabins, coughing and weak from sickness. Some children had fevers that left their small faces flushed and haunted. Men bore cuts and bruises from accidents, fights, or hard labor. The air smelled faintly of smoke, earth, and something else he couldn't quite place. The lingering scent of fear. He worked quickly, setting up a small area in the largest cabin to act as a makeshift clinic. Using supplies he had carried with him, he began tending to the sick and injured. He washed cuts with careful hands, applied poultices, and offered comfort to those who trembled with fever. The settlers watched him with a mixture of hope and disbelief. They had grown used to suffering, to the harshness of life on the edge of the frontier. Daniel's presence was a reminder that perhaps there was still help, still kindness, still a chance to survive. But it wasn't just the settlers who needed care. Daniel had heard whispers of the nearby Apache village, just a few miles over the hills. The Apache had long been in conflict with the settlers, but Daniel had no interest in those disputes. His concern was simple. Lives were at stake. If disease spread unchecked, it would affect everyone. His heart ached at the thought of children, whether settler or Apache, suffering needlessly. He decided to take a risk. With his supplies packed and his horse ready, he rode toward the Apache village. He knew the stories, that approaching the Apache could be dangerous, that they might see him as a threat or an intruder. But he also knew that fear and suspicion could be overcome with patience, respect, and action. Daniel rode slowly, keeping his hands visible and his tone gentle, calling out in a way he hoped would show he came in peace. At first, the Apache watched him from the edges of the forest, silent and cautious. Their eyes were sharp, their posture protective. But Daniel did not rush. He set up a small fire outside the edge of the village and began preparing water and simple remedies. Slowly, a few villagers approached, curious but wary. He spoke softly, explaining that he had come to help, not to harm. It took time, but trust began to grow. Children peeked from behind their parents' legs, drawn by the gentle manner of this strange man. Daniel treated minor injuries first, showing that he could be trusted. He listened more than he spoke, learning their names, understanding their customs, and respecting their ways. The Apache people were proud and cautious, and Daniel knew that only by honoring their dignity could he hope to help them fully. Days passed, and word spread that a young doctor had come to aid the sick in both communities. Some settlers watched from a distance, unsure if they should trust him, while others marveled at the care he provided. The Apache, too, observed him, noting the patience in his eyes, the steadiness of his hands, and the kindness in his gestures. Slowly, barriers that had existed for generations began to weaken. One evening, after a long day of treating patients and gathering supplies, Daniel sat by the fire outside the Apache village. The sky was painted with the colors of sunset, deep oranges, pinks, and purples blending into the night. He felt a mix of exhaustion and fulfillment. The work was far from over, but for the first time he felt that he was in the right place. He had come to heal, and perhaps in some small way he was beginning to bridge the gap between two worlds. From the shadows, a figure emerged. She was tall, with dark eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Daniel recognized her immediately as a leader among the Apache, a woman whose presence carried authority and wisdom. She did not speak at first, merely observing him. Daniel met her gaze respectfully, understanding that words were not needed yet. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but commanding. "You care for our people," she said. "You have no fear of what others might think. You do not treat us as enemies." Daniel bowed his head slightly. "I care for life," he said simply. "Everyone deserves help when they are sick or in pain." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Perhaps you are different," she said. "We will watch you. And maybe, if your heart remains true, we will allow you to help us fully." That night, as the stars filled the sky, Daniel felt a quiet determination rise within him. He had faced danger, skepticism and fear already, but he knew this was only the beginning. The frontier was vast, and its challenges were many. Yet, he felt ready to serve, to heal, and to learn from those who had survived in ways he could never have imagined. As he lay under the open sky, the wind whispering through the trees, Daniel thought of the days ahead. There would be sickness, struggles, and moments of doubt, but there would also be hope, connection, and the chance to make a real difference. He closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the frontier lull him into a brief rest, knowing that tomorrow he would continue his journey, not just as a doctor, but as a witness to courage, resilience, and the shared humanity of everyone he met. The morning air was sharp and cool when Daniel awoke to the sounds of coughing and the low moans of the sick. The little settlement he had come to help was quieter than usual, but not because of peace. It was the eerie silence that comes when people are weakened by illness. Children lay listless on thin blankets, their small bodies trembling with fever, and parents moved slowly from one to another, their faces lined with worry. Daniel had seen sickness before, but there was something different about this. It was spreading too quickly, too fiercely, and it did not discriminate. He moved immediately, checking the supplies he had brought and preparing what he could for the day ahead. His hands, steady and sure, became instruments of life, cutting cloth for bandages, boiling water to clean wounds, and mixing basic remedies that he hoped would stave off the worst of the illness. The settlers began to gather in the cabin where he worked, forming a line of hope and desperation. Their eyes reflected the strain of days spent fighting a disease they did not understand, and Daniel felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on his shoulders. By midday, the news reached him that the illness had spread beyond the settlement. Touching the nearby Apache village, Daniel knew that if he did not act quickly, it could devastate both communities. The frontier was already a harsh place. Disease made it cruel. Supplies were limited, and the path to the village was rough, strewn with rocks and thorns that tore at his horse's hooves and his own clothing. But Daniel did not hesitate. He mounted his horse, feeling the familiar tension of urgency press against his chest, and rode toward the Apache village, carrying the few precious medicines he could spare. As he approached the edge of the village, he saw the first signs of the crisis. A child sat on the ground, shivering violently, while a woman knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to comfort him. Others moved slowly, their faces pale, and their eyes dull. Daniel's heart clenched. These were people who had lived through hardships that many settlers could never imagine, yet now they were vulnerable, in need of someone to act. He dismounted carefully and called out softly, "I have medicine." "I can help," he said, keeping his voice calm. He did not want to startle them, only to show that he meant no harm. From the shadows, figures emerged. Men and women, cautious and alert, watched him carefully. Their eyes were sharp, measuring every movement, but desperation softened the initial fear. Daniel knelt beside the child first, checking his pulse and temperature, speaking in soothing tones. He applied what remedies he could, cleaning wounds and cooling fevers. Slowly the mother relaxed her grip, allowing him to work. It was not easy. The illness was relentless, and the supplies were few. Daniel worked tirelessly, moving from one person to another, his own hands growing raw from constant washing and bandaging. The sun climbed high, then began its slow descent, but still he did not stop. Every life mattered, every child's fever he could reduce, every wound he could treat. He knew it counted. The Apache began to watch him more closely, curiosity and respect mingling in their expressions. Among them was Nahe, the woman who had approached him the previous evening. Her eyes never left him, measuring his patience, his skill, and his courage. She saw a man who did not shy away from suffering, who did not discriminate, and she began to understand why he had risked entering their village. By the second day, Daniel realized he could not manage alone. He returned to the settlement to gather help, speaking to the settlers cautiously. "We need to work together," he said. "This illness does not care who you are. Children, elders, everyone is at risk. If we do not act, more will die." Some settlers nodded reluctantly, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. Others hesitated, unwilling to enter the Apache village, still wary of old fears and old conflicts. But Daniel's calm insistence and unwavering determination convinced a few brave souls to join him. Together they returned to the village, carrying supplies and a renewed sense of purpose. The days that followed were long and grueling. Daniel organized the efforts, assigning tasks and showing the settlers and Apache alike how to care for the sick. He taught them how to boil water for cleanliness, how to apply basic dressings, and how to monitor fevers. Everyone worked together, a fragile team united by a common goal. Despite the hardships, there were moments of hope and small victories. A child's fever would finally break, bringing a sigh of relief from anxious parents. A wounded man could walk again after careful treatment. These small successes fueled Daniel's determination. He encouraged the Apache to share their knowledge as well, learning which herbs and remedies they had used for generations. In return, he offered his medical knowledge, blending traditions to provide the best care possible. One evening, as the sun set behind the distant hills, Daniel found himself sitting with Nahe outside the village. The children, now calmer, played quietly nearby, their laughter faint but a welcome sound after days of fear. Nahe spoke softly, telling him about her people, their history, and the hardships they had endured. She spoke of the land, the rivers, and the mountains that had sustained them, and of the challenges they faced when settlers arrived. Daniel listened, realizing that understanding was as vital as medicine. Healing the body was important, but building trust and respect was equally crucial. Through shared effort, Daniel began to see a transformation in both communities. The settlers who had been skeptical were learning to respect the Apache, seeing their resilience and strength. The Apache in turn saw that not all outsiders brought harm, that some came with goodwill and a desire to help. The illness remained a threat, but a sense of hope began to grow alongside the fear. By the end of the first week, the immediate danger had begun to ease. Fevers that had once threatened to overwhelm the village were now manageable, and the sick were beginning to recover. Daniel's hands were sore and his body exhausted, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had made a difference, however small, and had shown that compassion could bridge even the widest divides. That night, as he prepared for a brief rest, Nahe approached him once more. Her presence was calm, yet commanding. She looked at him with a depth of understanding that went beyond words. "You care for my people," she said. "You do not fear what others might think. You do not treat us as enemies." Daniel met her gaze humbly. "I care for life," he said simply. "Every life matters." For a long moment they simply watched the stars together, silent companions in a world that had suddenly grown a little smaller. Daniel knew the crisis was not over. More challenges would come, more illness, more suffering. But he had made a start. He had shown that courage, compassion, and understanding could bring people together even in the darkest times. And in that quiet moment he understood something important. This was more than medicine. It was a chance to heal not just bodies, but hearts, minds, and the fragile bonds between communities. The Apache had begun to trust him, and the settlers had begun to see that help could come from unexpected places. Daniel felt a quiet resolve settle within him. No matter what came next, he would not turn away. He had chosen this path, and he would follow it wherever it led. As he lay beneath the wide open sky, the wind rustling through the trees, Daniel allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had faced fear, prejudice, and illness, but he had also witnessed resilience, courage, and kindness. The frontier was harsh, but it was alive with opportunity to heal, to connect, and to make a lasting difference. And as the first light of dawn touched the hills once more, he knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and the continued chance to bridge two worlds that had long been separated by fear, misunderstanding, and distance. The sun rose slowly over the hills, casting long shadows across the Apache village. Daniel had long since settled into a rhythm, moving between the settlers' cabins and the village, tending to the sick and teaching what he knew. But today felt different. He could sense a quiet shift in the atmosphere, as if the villagers were beginning to accept him not only as a healer, but as someone they could trust. Nahi appeared at the edge of the village, her dark eyes watching him with the calm, measured attention of someone who had seen far too much in her life to be easily impressed. But there was a spark of curiosity in her gaze, a question that needed answering. Who was this man who risked himself to help strangers, who did not judge them, and who moved with such gentle determination? Daniel approached her with a respectful nod. "Good morning," he said softly. "How are your people today?" Nahe studied him for a moment, then spoke. "Better than yesterday," she said. "The fever still troubles some, but they live." Daniel allowed himself a small smile, feeling a rare warmth in his chest. "That is good news. We are making progress, together." She nodded slowly. "I have watched you, Daniel. You do not treat us as enemies. You do not speak down to us. You see us as we are." He felt a deep humility at her words. "I have learned much from your people," he said. "Your knowledge of the land, your ways of caring for each other. These are lessons I could never have learned elsewhere." For a long moment they stood in silence, listening to the sounds of the village. Children's laughter, soft and tentative, floated through the air. The wind rustled the leaves of the trees, carrying the scent of the earth and the distant hills. Daniel felt a sense of peace, but also a growing understanding. He was no longer just a doctor. He was a bridge, fragile but important, between two worlds that had often feared each other. Over the next several days, Daniel spent more time with the Apache. He observed their traditions, their daily routines, and the quiet rituals that had sustained them for generations. He watched as women prepared food with care, sharing what little they had with each other, and as men worked to repair cabins and protect the village. Children ran freely, their energy boundless even in the shadow of sickness, and elders offered guidance with wisdom earned through years of experience. Nahi became his guide in understanding these ways. She showed him which herbs could be used to soothe fevers, how to prepare poultices with plants he had never seen before, and how to move through the land without disturbing its delicate balance. She did not lecture him, but allowed him to observe, to ask questions, and to learn through experience. Daniel absorbed every lesson with humility, realizing that his medical knowledge was only one part of healing. The other part was understanding the people, their culture, and the land they called home. As the bond between them grew, Daniel found himself sharing stories from his own life. He spoke of his small town back east, of the early days of his medical training, and of the countless people he had helped before he came west. He did not speak to impress, but to connect, and Nahi listened with quiet interest, occasionally nodding or asking gentle questions. Through these exchanges, a mutual respect blossomed, rooted in honesty and shared purpose. One afternoon, a child was brought to Daniel in distress. The little girl had fallen from a tree, scraping her knee and forehead badly. Her mother, frantic, looked to Daniel for guidance. Without hesitation, he knelt beside her, examining the wounds carefully. Nahi watched closely, offering her own knowledge of the plants that could aid healing. Together they cleaned and dressed the injuries, combining science and tradition in a seamless act of care. When the girl smiled through tears, clutching her mother's hand, Daniel felt a profound sense of accomplishment. It was not just the treatment that mattered. It was the cooperation, the shared trust, the recognition that two different worlds could come together for the sake of life itself. Nea's eyes met his, and for a moment, no words were needed. They had seen each other's hearts through action, not just words. Days turned into weeks, and the village slowly recovered from the illness. Daniel's presence had become a part of the daily life of both settlers and Apache alike. He taught the settlers how to respect the land and its people, encouraging them to observe the Apache ways rather than dismiss them. In turn, the Apache began to see that not all outsiders brought harm. Some came with kindness, patience, and a genuine desire to help. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel sat with Nahi by a small fire. The sky was painted with soft shades of orange and pink, reflecting in the quiet waters of a nearby stream. They spoke of the future, not in grand or abstract terms, but in simple hopes, that the sick would continue to recover, that children would be safe, and that the communities could coexist peacefully. Nahe's voice was steady but thoughtful. "Your people. They do not always understand us," she said. "They fear what they do not know. But you see us. You see what is true, not just what others tell you." Daniel nodded. "I have learned that fear is the greatest obstacle. It keeps people from seeing the truth, from understanding each other. We can overcome it only through patience and action." She studied him, then smiled faintly. "You are different. Not many would do what you do." "I do not feel different," Daniel said quietly. "I only do what I know is right." The fire crackled between them, a small circle of warmth in the vast wilderness. In that moment, Daniel felt a deep connection, not only to Nahe, but to the people she represented, to the land itself, and to the fragile but growing trust that had begun to form. He realized that healing was about more than medicine. It was about listening, observing, and walking alongside people in their struggles, no matter how unfamiliar those struggles might seem. As the night deepened, Nahe shared more of her people's stories. Tales of resilience, of survival against harsh winters and scarce food, of battles fought not with weapons but with wisdom and patience. Daniel listened, captivated not only by the history but by the lessons embedded in it. Lessons about respect, balance, and the strength of community. He began to understand that the Apache's survival was not only a matter of physical skill, but of spirit, and he felt honored to be welcomed into that spirit, even in a small way. In turn, Daniel shared his knowledge carefully. He demonstrated ways to boil water to prevent illness, how to care for wounds using both his medicine and the Apache herbs, and simple practices to monitor health. He never spoke as a teacher who knew everything, but as someone willing to learn as much as he taught. This humility only strengthened the bond, and Nahi began to trust him more deeply, allowing him closer to her community than any outsider had been before. One morning, Daniel noticed a small group of settlers lingering near the village edge, hesitant and wary. They had come to see the recovery for themselves, and perhaps to test whether the trust he had earned with the Apache was genuine. Daniel invited them to watch respectfully, explaining that fear could be overcome through understanding. Slowly, the settlers observed acts of care, cooperation, and mutual respect, and their skepticism began to waver. They saw the Apache not as distant or dangerous strangers, but as people with wisdom, strength, and dignity. By the end of the third week, the village had changed. The illness had waned, but more importantly, a sense of community had grown. Daniel had become a link between two worlds, showing that courage, kindness, and patience could bridge even the oldest divides. Children played openly, mothers moved with confidence, and elders shared smiles that had been absent for too long. One evening, as Daniel prepared to rest under the stars, Nahe approached him once more. Her face was calm but serious. "You have shown us care, patience, and courage," she said. "You have listened and learned. You have treated our people as equals. For that, I respect you."
Daniel met her gaze, feeling a quiet pride and humility at the same time. "I only did what I could," he said softly.
"I learned from your people as much as I taught." Nahi nodded, her eyes reflecting the light of the fire in the sky above. "Perhaps one day our peoples will understand each other better. Perhaps they will see that trust is stronger than fear." Daniel smiled faintly, feeling hope stir in his heart. He knew the journey was far from over. Challenges would come again, and he would need courage, wisdom, and patience to face them. But for now, he allowed himself to rest in the knowledge that he had begun something important. A bond, fragile but real, that could grow into understanding and peace. As he lay beneath the open sky, the wind carrying the scents of earth and fire, Daniel thought of the path ahead. He had seen fear, hardship, and sickness, but he had also seen resilience, compassion, and trust. The frontier was harsh, but it was alive with life, connection, and the possibility of change. And he knew that as long as he continued to walk with courage and humility, he could make a difference, not just in healing bodies, but in uniting hearts across divides that had lasted generations. The morning sun filtered through the tall trees surrounding the Apache village, casting golden streaks across the ground. Daniel woke to the sound of soft laughter, a sound that had been absent for weeks. The children were running freely again, their small voices full of energy and life. Mothers moved with confidence, tending to their homes and families, while elders spoke quietly, sharing advice and guidance without the fear that had shadowed their days before. Daniel stretched, feeling the weight of exhaustion in his body, but also a profound sense of satisfaction. The sickness that had threatened to overwhelm the village and the nearby settlement was now under control. Fevers had subsided, wounds had healed, and the community had begun to recover not just physically, but in spirit. Daniel knew that the journey had been difficult, but he also understood that this moment was one of triumph. A triumph not just of medicine, but of trust, understanding, and human connection. As he prepared his small area for the day's work, Nahi approached him. Her steps were quiet, measured, but her presence commanded attention. Daniel looked up, and for the first time he noticed the depth of emotion in her eyes. Pride, respect, and gratitude all intertwined. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice steady yet filled with meaning. "You have done what few could do. You came here without fear, without prejudice, and you have cared for our people as if they were your own. For that, we are grateful." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He had worked tirelessly, often thinking of the sick and injured as faces rather than numbers, but hearing these words made the effort feel real, tangible. "I only did what I could," he said humbly. "I could not have done it without the help of your people, without their knowledge and guidance." Nahe shook her head gently. "No," she said firmly. "It is you who risked yourself for us. You walked into danger when others would have stayed away. You did not see us as strangers, enemies, or obstacles. You saw us as people. And for that, you have earned our respect." Daniel lowered his gaze, feeling a mixture of humility and quiet pride. He had never sought recognition, never cared for praise, but in that moment, he realized the depth of the bond he had formed. It was not just about saving lives, it was about building trust, understanding, and hope. The villagers gathered slowly, drawn by Nahi's words and by the sight of Daniel standing quietly among them. Men, women, and children alike approached, some with hesitant smiles, others with eyes shining with gratitude. One by one they offered simple gestures, bows of respect, nods of acknowledgement, and, in the case of the children, shy waves. Nahi turned to Daniel once more, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that spoke louder than words. "You saved my people," she said, her voice carrying the weight of all she had witnessed. "And for that I offer you this. You may ask me for anything, and I will do what I can to honor it." The words struck Daniel deeply. He had never expected such an offer. In all his years of service, he had helped many, but he had never been given such a gift of trust and respect. He looked around at the villagers, seeing the hope and relief on their faces, and understood that any request he made could have consequences, not just for him, but for the community he had come to care for so deeply. He paused, weighing his thoughts carefully. To ask for wealth or comfort would be selfish. To demand influence over the village would betray the trust they had given him. He wanted something that would honor their gift, something that would create a lasting good. Finally he spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Nahe, my request is simple. I ask that we continue to work together, settlers and Apache alike, to protect this village, to care for the sick, and to teach our children the value of understanding and respect. I ask that we build a place where knowledge, care, and compassion can flourish, for the good of all." Nahe's eyes softened, and a smile touched her lips. She nodded slowly. "Then it shall be so," she said. "Not because you ask, but because it is right. We will stand with you, as you have stood with us." The villagers murmured their agreement, their voices weaving a chorus of unity and commitment. Daniel felt a warmth in his chest, a deep satisfaction that went beyond any physical reward. He had come as a stranger, risking life and comfort to help those in need, and now he was being welcomed not just as a healer, but as a friend, a partner, and a bridge between two worlds. Over the next days, Daniel and Nahi began to work on their shared vision. They organized efforts to strengthen the village's health, combining traditional Apache knowledge with modern medical practices. Children were taught hygiene and basic care, while elders shared stories and wisdom that connected the past to the present. Settlers and Apache alike joined in the work, slowly breaking down barriers that had existed for generations. Daniel found himself learning more than he ever expected. He learned the value of patience, the strength in listening, and the importance of humility. He discovered that healing was not just about medicine. It was about understanding people, respecting their traditions, and working together toward a common goal. Nahi, in turn, saw the power of courage and kindness. She recognized that Daniel's actions had not only saved lives, but had shown her people that outsiders could be trusted, that understanding could replace fear, and that cooperation could create lasting change. She began to share more of her people's knowledge with him, confident that he would use it wisely and respectfully. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple, Daniel and Nahe sat together by a small fire. The village was calm, the children asleep, and the adults engaged in quiet conversation. Daniel reflected on all that had happened, the sickness, the fear, the moments of doubt and struggle, and realized how far they had come. "You have changed things here," Nahe said quietly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Not just with your medicine, but with your heart. You have shown my people that trust is stronger than fear, and kindness stronger than suspicion." Daniel smiled faintly, feeling the weight of her words. "I could not have done it alone," he replied. "It is the people, your people, who have made this possible. I have only guided where I could." Nahi reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "And yet, it is you who took the first step. It is you who chose to see us as equals. That choice matters more than you realize." As the night deepened, Daniel felt a profound sense of connection, not just to Nahe, but to the entire community. He understood that their lives were now intertwined, bound by shared experiences, mutual respect, and the knowledge that together they could face challenges that alone might have been insurmountable. In the following days, Daniel worked to solidify the bonds he had formed. He helped establish a small area in the village where both settlers and Apache could come for medical care, education, and guidance. He encouraged the children to learn from each other, to play together, and to share knowledge freely. Slowly but surely, the community began to see itself as one, not divided by fear or prejudice, but united by shared purpose and understanding. Nahi remained by his side, guiding him, teaching him, and ensuring that the village's traditions were respected. Together, they became a symbol of what could be achieved when courage, compassion, and respect were placed above fear and suspicion. And in the quiet moments when the children were asleep and the village was at peace, Daniel would often find himself thinking back to the moment when Nahe first spoke those words, "You saved my people. Now you may ask me for anything." He understood now that her offer was more than gratitude. It was a promise, a bond, and a challenge. It was a reminder that every choice he made would carry weight, that every action could ripple through the lives of those who trusted him. Daniel had always known that life on the frontier was unpredictable, that danger and hardship were never far away. But he also knew that the moments of courage, kindness, and connection were what made the journey worthwhile. And now, as he looked across the village, at the smiling children, the recovered sick, and the community working together in harmony, he understood the true meaning of his journey. He had also healed hearts. He had come to teach, but he had also learned. And he had come as a stranger, but he had been welcomed as one of their own. In that moment, Daniel felt a quiet resolve. He would continue this work, for as long as he could, knowing that the bonds he had forged would endure. He had been given a rare gift, the trust and gratitude of a people who had lived in fear for too long. And he would honor that gift with every action, every choice, and every day that remained. The fire crackled softly beside him as the stars began to fill the sky. Daniel and Na sat in companionable silence, knowing that together they had created something extraordinary. It was more than recovery, it was hope. More than survival, it was trust. And more than friendship, it was a promise that, even in a world filled with fear and uncertainty, courage, kindness, and understanding could change everything. The early morning sun painted the hills in soft gold and pink. The village was alive again, not just surviving, but thriving. Children ran along the dirt paths, their laughter ringing out across the settlement. Mothers moved with purpose and energy, tending to gardens and cooking fires. The elders walked slowly but confidently, offering guidance to all who would listen. Life had returned, and with it, hope. Daniel felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Weeks of tireless work, of careful observation, and of learning from the Apache had brought the village back from the brink. But he knew that the true success was not measured by how many lives had been saved or how many fevers had broken, but by the bonds that had been formed. The trust that had been built between people who had once been wary of each other. Nahe appeared at his side, her presence calm and steady as always. She looked around the village with a hint of pride in her eyes. "You have done more than heal the sick," she said softly. "You have shown our people that kindness can cross any boundary, that trust can overcome fear. That is a gift that will last long after the illness is gone." Daniel nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. "I could not have done it without your guidance," he said. "Your knowledge, patience, and courage made this possible. I only hope that the work we have done continues, even when I am gone." Nahi's eyes softened.
"It will," she said. "You have planted seeds, Daniel, and they will grow."
"Your presence has taught us to look at the world differently, to see not enemies, but people. And that is a lesson we will pass on." Over the following weeks, Daniel worked alongside both the settlers and the Apache to create a lasting system of care and learning. Together, they built a small clinic in the heart of the village, a place where both communities could come for medical help, for guidance, and for learning. Daniel taught basic hygiene, methods to prevent illness, and ways to care for injuries. The Apache shared their knowledge of herbs, traditional remedies, and survival techniques, blending the wisdom of generations with the practical medicine Daniel had brought from afar. Children became students of both worlds. They learned not only reading, writing, and counting, but also the value of compassion, respect, and cooperation. Daniel watched them with a quiet smile as they ran freely, sharing games, stories, and knowledge without prejudice or fear. He realized that the future he had hoped for was beginning to take shape before his very eyes. The settlers, too, were transformed. Men who had once viewed the Apache with suspicion now worked alongside them, repairing cabins, tending fields, and assisting with medical care. Women shared recipes, stories, and wisdom. Slowly, the invisible walls of fear and misunderstanding were replaced with bridges of trust and friendship. Daniel often spent his evenings walking along the outskirts of the village, reflecting on all that had happened. He remembered the day he had first arrived, the fear in the eyes of both settlers and Apache, and the heavy weight of responsibility he had felt. Now, as he watched the community moving in harmony, he understood that courage, patience, and kindness could change the course of many lives. One afternoon, Nahi approached him with a quiet determination. "Daniel," she said, "it is time that we plan for the future. You have helped us recover, but the world is not always kind. We must ensure that the lessons we have learned together continue to guide us." Daniel agreed, and together they worked on a plan to ensure the village's lasting stability. They organized regular gatherings where settlers and Apache could share knowledge, discuss problems, and support each other. They trained apprentices in medicine, teaching both the skills Daniel had brought and the traditional healing methods of the Apache. They planted gardens that could provide food year-round, and they repaired cabins to withstand storms and harsh weather. Through these efforts, Daniel saw the community begin to thrive in ways he had only dreamed of. The sickness that had once threatened to destroy them was a distant memory, replaced by the resilience and strength of a people who had learned to trust and support one another. The bonds he had formed with Nahad and her people became the foundation for a community that would endure, long after he was gone. In quiet moments, Daniel reflected on the lessons he had learned. He had come to the frontier to heal bodies, but he had discovered that healing hearts and minds was just as important. He had learned that respect, patience, and empathy could bridge even the widest divides, and he had seen firsthand that courage was not only in facing danger, but in choosing kindness when fear might have made it easier to turn away. Nahe remained a constant presence, guiding her people and supporting Daniel in his work. They shared a quiet understanding, a bond forged not just in words, but in action. Their partnership became a symbol for the entire community, proof that trust and collaboration could overcome fear, prejudice, and hardship. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky glowed with shades of orange and violet, Daniel and Nahi stood together overlooking the village. Children played freely, parents tended to their families, and elders shared stories by the fires. The village was alive, not just with survival, but with hope and opportunity. "You have given us more than medicine," Nahi said quietly. "You have given us hope, trust, and a path forward. Your work will be remembered for generations." Daniel smiled, feeling a quiet pride and humility. "I have only shown what is possible when people work together. It is your courage, wisdom, and resilience that made this possible." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the life of the village continue. Daniel knew that his time here would eventually come to an end, but he also knew that the legacy of what they had built together would endure. The children would grow up learning not only how to survive, but how to live with respect and understanding. The settlers and Apache would continue to work together, guided by the lessons they had learned from one another. And the bonds formed in this time of crisis and recovery would carry forward, strengthening the community for generations to come. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to prepare for his departure. He had fulfilled his mission, and though he would miss the village and the people who had become like family, he knew it was time for them to continue without him. He gathered supplies for the clinic, trained apprentices in medicine, and ensured that both settlers and Apache knew how to continue caring for one another. On the day of his departure, the entire village gathered to see him off. Children waved, mothers and fathers nodded, and elders offered blessings. Nahe stood at the forefront, her eyes shining with respect and gratitude. "You have saved my people," she said once more, echoing the words she had spoken weeks earlier. "And now you have given us the tools to carry forward." "We will not forget you, Daniel. Your name will be remembered here, not just as a healer, but as a friend and a guide." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. "I will carry all of you in my heart," he said. "Remember, it is not one person who changes a community. It is all of you working together." With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode away, the village fading into the distance behind him. But even as he left, He felt the enduring presence of the bonds he had formed. The trust, respect, and hope that had been nurtured here would remain long after he was gone. As the hills stretched out before him and the sun rose higher in the sky, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The illness, the fear, the moments of doubt, and the small victories that had grown into lasting change. He knew that the frontier was full of challenges, but he also knew that courage, compassion, and understanding could leave a mark that no hardship could erase. And so, Daniel continued his journey, carrying with him the lessons of the village, the friendship of Nahe, and the knowledge that even in the harshest places, hope and kindness could flourish. His work had created more than recovery. It had created a legacy, a living reminder that trust, empathy, and shared humanity could overcome fear, division, and adversity. The wind whispered through the trees. The sun warmed his back, and the path ahead stretched wide and inviting. Daniel rode on, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the bonds he had formed and the lives he had touched would endure, shining as a beacon of hope for all who came after.